Well, wasn't that a wonderful way to sort of bring our day, to an initial conclusion before the panel, just to come back and think about the big picture and the wonder of nature. So thank you very much for that. And actually, it's probably about the most important thing we can all think about is how this gets outside a tiny room like this in National Museum for Scotland, on a Monday afternoon, because people don't know about this, right? And I think they really need to. So please, could I invite all the panelists up to the panel discussion? And I'm going to start looking around the room because I know there's a lot of questions out there. Sorry? Oh, yes, I can go back a slide. Oh, gosh. Right. We must be missing a slide. Oh, dear. The well-oiled machine. Well, I think it's very nice to leave the puffins, actually, if that's okay. Yeah, let's leave the puffins. And that's given you lots of time to think of some zingy questions. So who's going to go first? Please, at the front. Christine.
Yeah. So I'm going to, I don't know if this is on, I'll just shout. I'm going to ask Jay a question, which is, thank you, Jay, it was very elegiac what you were saying. However, what is your definition of nature? Because there is a tension between those of us who work with biodiversity and the people who sort of enthuse about nature. And sometimes the organisms that we think are very important are sometimes organisms that people who love nature go, but I don't like malaria protozoa. Or, you know what I'm saying? So what
Absolutely.
is your definition of nature?
Okay, I love that, actually, as an example. I think that's absolutely brilliant because my aspiration is to make everyone love the things they don't think they love. I mean, it's so important, and that was partly why I made that link to the puffins. I probably didn't make it very well, to be fair, but if you bring it back to things that people go, ugh, that's squidgy and not very nice, I don't like it, it might bite me, it might whatever. It's a way of, I think it's so important to use what we have. I'm trying to answer your question, but I'm trying to do it in a holistic sense. To use what we have to say nature is everything that is beautiful about our world. And even the things that you think you don't like, kind of Chris Packham-esque, like a wasp. It's that sort of... if we can find a way of making our fellow human beings love and respect nature, whatever that is, then we have a chance to fix this together. So that's my take on nature.
Okay, thank you. And another question at the front, and then who would like to go next? And then...
So, Martin Lilly from DEFRA. It's a question for both Kate and for Murray. In a world where partial decommissioning is acceptable, what is the amount of structure, be that oil and gas or offshore wind, that you would leave to remove all of the invasive species, but also to have a lot of cold water coral structure still left? So what's the ideal depth that you would
That's a tough one. Do you want to go first, Kate? Or would you like me to?
Yeah. Did you mean did you say there in terms of the level, in terms of the depth that you would leave?
How would you take it off?
Okay.
How far would you leave?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of invasive species, it's kind of that annoying one where it depends on the context. So, it depends on what you're trying to protect in the area, it depends on what invasive species are there and what part of the structure they might be using and things like that. So sort of thinking about that study that I mentioned about, the highest numbers, if you like, seem to be in that intertidal, shallow subtidal. That's not to say there aren't some that are also deeper. So I guess in an ideal world, perhaps the whole thing, but it's not as easy as that because of all these brilliant positive effects that leaving the structures have. So it's one of those ones where it's a really tricky pros and cons evaluation, and it would be very hard to put a figure on that and an ideal depth without sort of understanding that wider kind of environment and the sort of objectives, if you like, for that area. So I appreciate it's a bit of an annoying response. It's not easy. In terms of the amount of structure, it's a similar story, I would say. If you have a really, really healthy ecosystem and you have no non-native species nearby, they're not likely to survive in the future, etc. Climate change is a tricky one. We have to think forward, and a lot of non-natives that aren't a problem now could become one in the future. So again, it's a really context-dependent answer. But yeah, is there anything either of you would like to add?
Well, I can just add. This is where you start thinking collaboratively, and you add biodiversity monitoring, AI species recognition a year before. You think ahead. You monitor, you identify depth, you identify species, you identify native, non-native, invasive, non-invasive. You'll get a percentage of how much they populate the structure, which part of the structure they populate. There could be hotspots for certain species. And that's when you start addressing it eventually.
And for the deep sea corals specifically, they're not found in the shallower areas of the platform. They're found where the Atlantic water influence is strong. So typically it's around 50, 60 meters and down in the northern North Sea. We haven't done any surveys there, and I'm not aware of many deeper surveys that have scraped the platforms and looked for invasives at those depths. That's something we'd be super fascinated to look at. But the key thing is, in all the models that we've run, in collaboration with PML and others, the North Sea remains highly suitable habitat right through the 21st century and into the next century, whereas the deeper dwelling areas, which currently are so important for deep sea coral diaspora in the Atlantic, become unsuitable, as we've seen. So I think that's kind of a really interesting opportunity to look at. Now, we have a question, I think, at the top of the room. Please.
Thanks very much. Sam Fanshawe, Blue Marine Foundation. Certainly getting a sense of déjà vu. So I was involved in some of the Rigs to Reefs work, 25 years ago. Murray, I think you were still doing your PhD then, so I probably trump you on the age stakes. What's been really interesting is having gone through the whole Brent Spar situation, that long ago, and as you say earlier, the public led that policy decision, potentially not necessarily with the best sort of evidence and scientific and ecological consequences in mind at that time. It does feel like we're now coming full circle to, with all of the science that we have and all of the nature that has grown on those structures. I was just wondering is how, given that we're now talking about nature-inclusive design for these new structures, but the policy is currently still dictating that those structures should be removed, and so nature-inclusive design is not being embraced by the industry because they are, from my understanding, they know that at the moment, the policy says that they will have to remove that and destroy all that nature. So I'm just wondering, how do we get round full circle again to getting some real sort of, common sense?
Thanks so much for asking that question. That was a question I had on my piece of paper in case nobody asked a question. So can I throw it open to the panel? Because this is a really kind of the nub of it. What do we think? So for instance, offshore wind operators are looking to, why would they? Why would they invest when 25 years in, if the structure is that sort of lifespan, it all has to come out?
I think part of... Do I kick off?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think part of this is absolutely, and I love this question because it is the nub of it, basically. We have to find a way, and I think a lot of this comes back to sense of place and people and community, and how do we bring people on this journey? How do we collaborate? How do we actually make this happen? Because right now that legislation is just, it doesn't make any sense. So how do we change that? How do we influence that? I would suggest that the most powerful influencer any of us will ever come across is people. It's the power of people saying, this is what we want. And I think in many ways that's where it links into a desire to say, Brent Spar is a really good example of how things went really badly wrong. How can we avoid that next time round? How can we bring people with us, the general public, anyone that's out there? How can we tell people, this is what we're talking about here. This is where the science is going. This is where it's exciting. How do we get people on side so that we can actually make this make sense? I would suggest that's our ace in the hole.
Thank you. And I would argue letting people know about it, is the first step. What other questions do we have? I'm sure there's more points or questions. Sorry, at the top again. Thank you.
Anya Thomas, independent, I guess. Just talking about the use of terms like restoration and nature-inclusive design, and then earlier on in the day talking about how there is no getting back to that square one that the sea, the ocean used to be at, however many centuries and decades ago. Are we as an industry and as academics aiming for trying to do that, no matter how impossible it could be or seems to be, or is there aiming for a new step, stay square one under a new, this is what the ocean should be?
Thanks so much. That's another great question. A difficult one. Who would like to go?
You'll do both. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. You know, we have had shifting baselines, and at the same time, it's quite unrealistic to pretend that we can go exactly back to what they were all that time ago. I think, you know, there has been increasing awareness of this idea of ecosystem services and natural capital, and that's maybe one approach we could take, is thinking how can we optimise those things, those ecosystem services, whether that's environmental, economic and social. So that's one way. And acknowledging that, yeah, we cannot necessarily go back to those prime conditions, and just being aware that all of the positives of things like artificial structures and making sure the public are aware of those positives. Yeah, it's a hard one to answer. I don't think we can go back to exactly how it was decades ago. We have to work with what we've got and what we can protect now, rather than spending lots of resources trying to fix things, if you like, trying to go back to how they were. I don't know if you want to...
No, I was going to say the same. Yeah. I completely agree. I think we're finding ourselves within the new baseline. We have, you know, let's say 40, 50 years of good data now. Use that data, use it to our advantage, and sort of move forward now, rather than look back.
Mm.
Great, thank you. And one thing I'd add, I totally agree with those points, and things have changed. We are continuing to install things into the sea at pace, and we'll continue to do that. There's an interesting discussion earlier about keeping monitoring the same or advancing monitoring and new ideas coming, and I'd be very much on that side of the equation. The scientific community has a lot of really cool new ways of doing things, including measuring ecosystem function in really quite, you know, innovative ways. They're in the realms of academia and research now, but they're starting to move to industry. That's happening. We're seeing that. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about when actually the world's changing so fast, and we can be quite pessimistic. Hank.
Thanks, Murray. It's a question for you, actually. It ties together a few of these points, but it goes back to your coral images that you showed from 2010, I believe, where the coral didn't seem quite as large or as widespread as it is now. It's almost like it's just exploded over the last 15 years. I'm wondering sort of about the lifespan of these structures at sea, and it relates to if we do keep some of our wind structures in place going into the future. It seems like it takes the coral a while to settle and to grow, and I don't know, but this is part of my question. And I mean, is that the case? And in which case, arguably keeping these structures in place for longer gives greater opportunities for those corals to take hold and reach perhaps climax communities.
Yeah, so I think the pictures were in Joe's talk, and absolutely, you see them growing, and it was remarkable to see just how fast, how long that's taken to really become now smothering the platforms. But the big question, I guess, that we're not having is, well, would those corals have been there if it weren't for the platforms? And that's where we actually don't know scientifically. We do know west of Shetland because Wyville Thompson went out in the 1870s and dredged and wrote wonderful books about what he found. So we have historical ecological data. We don't have that for most of the North Sea. It's a mostly muddy basin in the northern North Sea, but there will be drop stones, there will be hard substrate, and we haven't mapped that entire basin at the resolution to know, but we have trawled it. So we're not quite certain. We can't put really hard and fast science on that. But the habitat suitability is off the charts. The corals love it there. And it remains in the future a suitable place. So going back to this point about our changed ocean, I think we have to work with the grain of the wood here and look after the areas that will be suitable in the future and not forget about them. So if we go ahead and decommission everything and say bye-bye to 50 years of deep-sea coral growth, when the natural populations, right, quotes natural populations, are going to be really suffering, that's possibly quite a bad decision to make. And that's kind of where we're coming from in the research we're doing. And I think, have we got to wrap now, or one more?
One more.
Time for one more. Who wants the last word?
One online, sorry.
Please, let's go online. We're going to go online.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's from Bethany Wills again, and it's a bit of an open question, and it's to anyone. Is anyone aware of offshore wind infrastructure that is or is planned to be reused by another industry post-operation? For example, the aquaculture or for wave energy, or do the materials come to the end of life within those 30 years?
Who would like to take that one? Any ideas?
I can make a stab. I can start. I do know that it's something in terms of the offshore wind industry. The industry per se is definitely trying to do a lot more of this. There is a company called Reblade who take the blades of offshore wind, because they are massive, absolutely huge, and they use them for all sorts of different things, but particularly in school playgrounds. So a great organisation. I think, again, it's that sort of thing where here we have the chance for innovation, for creativity, for you've got these structures, so much of it can be reused, recycled, you know, whatever we can do with it, what can we do with it to make it a good thing for nature? Again, for me, it comes back to the whatever we do, whatever that is, whether that's decommissioning, whether it's reusing, whether it's repurposing, whether it's building from scratch. If you come at the premise of put the natural world first, as in what can we do to make this better and not make it worse? But that's just one example. Let me hand over to you.
Yeah, sure. It's not an area I know a lot about, but my thoughts would be you've got your marine licence for that specific operation and maintenance phase, and that obviously construction prior to that. You get your marine licence for decommissioning. I imagine in terms of logistics, it would be then quite challenging to reuse those structures when they're potentially compromised in, view of policy and everything else. In terms of, they have been subject to stresses and strains. I don't know whether in terms of money and evaluation and assessment and trying to go through that marine licensing, whether somebody would want to try and do that, which is, in some ways a shame. It'd be great if they could be reused in sort of those ways. But what might be more realistic is sort of the recycling, remove or recycle and then use them for other things like you were mentioning there. And there is this concept I'm aware of, again, I don't know a huge amount about it, and I don't know how futuristic it is or whether it's happening now, this idea of multi-use platforms and areas. So maybe rather than thinking about can we reuse it at the end, thinking about that at the beginning, thinking can we have aquaculture here, can we have, whatever else we can have in that area and use those structures in other ways, not just renewables. Yeah. That's my thoughts.
All right, well, listen, everyone, can we thank the panel very much, and